Hello, everybody. It's working, right? I'm Nancy Horowitz. I'm the director of the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here today. We're very excited about this program. We thought it was just a wonderful idea to bring André de Quadros here to show us his work. He's a very special scholar, and he's doing very special work that I feel is needed now more than ever. His thoughtful and philosophical approach counters the superficiality that's so often found today. It counters putting labels on people to then exclude them. It counters binary oppositions that lack nuance and depth. The work he does is difficult and painful, yet so necessary to find common ground. How do we sit with difference, even if it makes us uncomfortable? I think is one of the issues that comes up. There is so very much at stake right now, especially. Disinformation, manipulations to shape public opinion. Not only do we live in divisive times, we live in ignorant times as well, where it's easier to repeat slogans than do the research necessary to develop informed and nuanced opinions. The new Living Our Values initiative, which is helping us support this program, seeks to bring us together so that we may discuss difficult issues with each other. In his work over decades, André fully engages with this concept. André, if you want to disagree with anything I'm saying, go ahead. He is a professor of music at the College of Fine Arts, and I have to say we're incredibly lucky to have him on this campus. He's a human rights activist. He's a conductor. He's an ethnomusicologist, a music educator, and a writer whose work has taken him to the most diverse settings in 40 countries, including professional ensembles, projects with prisons, psychosocial rehabilitation, refugees, and victims of sexual violence, torture, and trauma. He has been described as one of the most inspiring human rights educators of our time by the Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights. This institute is named after Raoul Wallenberg, who was a Swedish diplomat who saved tens of thousands of people towards the end of the war. The institute covers most regions in the world. They do crucial work to contribute to a wider understanding and respect for human rights and international humanitarian law. To receive such praise from the Wallenberg Institute is very high praise indeed, and I've just learned that they are helping to support his work. André leads Common Ground Voices, an Israeli-Palestinian peace-building and reconciliation initiative. Through this project and numerous others in Israel and the Arab world, he's used music as a means of community mobilization and intercultural dialogue. A childhood refugee, his life's work has been aimed at the establishment of fair and equitable social systems. Many years working with rival prison gangs and divided communities has served as a model for reconciliation work. We're also lucky to have a respondent here tonight, Dr. Carrie Preston, who is a professor in the English department and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program. Her writing on gender, sexuality, race, performance, and critical displacement has appeared in 3 books and numerous articles, and she has a very recent book entitled Complicit Participation, the liberal audience for theater of racial justice. It was published by Oxford University Press this year. Complicit Participation is a critique of shallow performances of allyship, and she'll be giving a book talk this Monday, November 4th at 5 p.m. at the Data Sciences Building, room 950. My deep thanks go to the Living Our Values initiative for helping us to get the word out, the Howard Thurman Center for helping us to use this great space, the Center of Forced Displacement for their co-sponsorship, and of course the staff of the Elie Wiesel Center, especially Teresa Cooney, who as usual is outside but helping. Without her help and the staff's help, none of these events would be possible. There'll be time for questions afterwards and a reception in the lobby. Please join me in welcoming Professor André de Quadros.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Thank you for Nancy, as you know, is the director of our Elie Wiesel Center, and thank you for initiating this invitation and for moderating, for Carrie, for responding after this is over, and of course to all of you for being here. I'm deeply grateful that so many of you are present here to listen and to engage today, not just with me, but with each other. I would like to acknowledge that you might be here with heartbreak and outrage, as I am. I welcome all of your feelings and thoughts. I hope that you can experience the opportunity to express yourself after I've finished presenting. In welcoming your feelings, I have no right to ask you to constrain your comments or questions. I have not lost family members in Russia, Palestine, Ukraine, Israel, Yemen, Sudan, Lebanon, Afghanistan, or the West Bank, and I do not have a loved one being held prisoner or hostage, at least not outside this country. I have inside this country, but not outside this country. Who am I to require you to engage in civil discourse? In my presentation, I will do my best to be gentle and sensitive, but I say that if I say something to you that is triggering, I ask your forgiveness. Before we start formally, I'm going to ask you, with your permission, to engage in a few minutes of silent meditation. Silent meditations are a standard part of my practice in many different settings, and I have found that moments of mindfulness in prisons, in war zones, in other places of harm and hurt can create conditions of receptivity. To that end, please make yourself comfortable in your chair. Put your phone on silent. Now I invite you to place both feet on the floor with your hands on your lap. Now cast your eyes forward. Soften your eyes. Gaze into the distance. Let your eyes close gently. And for the next minute or so, just focus on your breathing. Breathing slowly and deeply. Let your shoulders drop. Allow yourself to be present for yourself. And I won't speak for the next minute to allow you to find these moments of tranquility, breathing deeply and slowly. Feel free to open your eyes whenever you can, whenever you like. In welcoming you today, I also welcome your loved ones, past and present, the people who have enriched your lives. I welcome your gender identity and sexual orientation, your faith, your political perspectives, yes, especially these perspectives that are divergent. I welcome all of you. If you look around the room, you see we are more than students, faculty, staff, and community members. We are whole and complex persons. I embrace your dreams, your broken dreams, your anguish, your ambitions, your struggles, your joy, your hiddenness, your internal struggles. I embrace you as precious human beings. Say after me, I will be your standing stone. I will stand by you. Now sing after me. I will be your standing stone. Sing. I will be your standing stone. I will stand by you. I will stand by you. From the beginning. I will be your standing stone. I will stand by you again. I will be your standing stone. I will stand by you. Sing as if you mean it. I will be your standing stone. I will stand by you. I will stand by you once again. I will stand by you. I will stand by you for the last time. I will stand by you. Thank you. I think we can all agree that since October the 7th, engaging in any kind of discourse has been really challenging. I fully understand the polarization that we see, particularly in the world's Western liberal democracies. We are more deeply divided than ever before, and worse than that, sometimes we can't even find the words and the space to speak about what we can't speak about. So now let's go to the screen. See the QR code on the screen. Take your phone out and scan the QR code and complete the prompt. The prompt says, I find it difficult to speak about. And so when the QR code takes you, leave the QR code there and just while you're grabbing the QR code, and then you, and then all the responses are anonymous, just to reassure you. And once you've done that, and you complete the prompt, and then you'll see my wonderful colleague Brian, who's managing our slides, for which I'm grateful, is going to take us to this and share the screen there, Brian. So this is what's coming up on the screen. So as people are adding in, Brian's going to travel the screen up so you can start to read what's if you take a look at the screen and see what folks have written, you see how we have an enormous cross-section of feelings and responses. And that provides a bit of a springboard for my presentation. So why are we here today? Well, we would certainly almost not have been here if October the 7th had not happened. Each of us in our own ways tries to find a pathway to make sense of what is happening, and in which we try to imagine what might happen in the future. But it's not only about October the 7th. It's also about November the 5th, just 6 days from now. We are in a time not only of polarization, but a profoundly dangerous time of fracture, social fragmentation, and the collapse of the social contract. Might I suggest that the topic of dialogue is particularly relevant today at a time when nearly 1 in 4 Americans believe that political violence is justified. Let me give you a structure for my presentation. I expect to take about 45 minutes. In the first part, I would like to locate myself not only within the Israeli-Palestinian situation, but also more broadly. I intend to present a framework for my own peace and justice work. Then I'm going to proceed to argue for dialogue. What is dialogue? How do I work with it, and why? Finally, I'm going to present my work with Common Ground Voices and Israeli-Palestinian Grassroots Narrative and Dialogue Initiative. Well, who am I? Quite apart from the generous introduction that Nancy gave me before I spoke, here's a bit more detail. As she said, I was an asylum seeker as a child, smuggled in a boat, and kept in hiding. I had very early encounters as a brown boy with race during the white Australia policy. My family was caught up in the fight for and against colonization, with my uncle being the target of an attempted assassination by letter bomb in the 1950s. In the 17th century, at least one of my ancestors was burnt alive by the Portuguese Inquisition for worshipping idols. I was involved in the student resistance movement in India in the early 1970s and later in the anti-war movement in Australia. When I received my first Indian passport, the 3 countries that I was forbidden to visit were what the government regarded as apartheid regimes: the Republic of South Africa, Rhodesia, as Zimbabwe was known then, and Israel. From a very early age, I was separated from both my mother's and father's family because they were on the other side of different political borders. In a culture that is grounded in extended and joint families, this was very unusual. My mother was a stateless woman until she was in her late 50s. From an early age, partly because of radical ideas and partly from personal experience of abuse, I conceived a resistance to violence, which has only been heightened by living in the United States, the epicenter and source of much of the world's violence at home and abroad. If I think about conflict, I imagine the gangs with whom I've worked, the victims of police violence, the survivors of torture and sexual violence. My work has taken me to the heart wounds of so many people in different shatter zones, here in Boston, in the Arab world, in Afghanistan, on the Mexico-US border, in Israel and beyond. I cannot unhear the screams of people being tortured in American prisons. These experiences have deeply changed my body and heart. I stand in front of you today not to present an expert opinion. I am neither a political scientist, nor a historian, nor a community psychologist. I am a human being in grief and anger, in trying to understand what it means to be human, what it means to be an artist and teacher in this desperate time. Shortly after I arrived in the US about 23 years ago, just before September the 11th, the government embarked on yet another unjustified war, and I was deeply troubled. In an effort to find personal meaning, I started working in prisons. And about the same time, I started conversations with my Israeli and Palestinian colleagues about starting a community arts project there. But the collaboration was slightly delayed because of an initiative I co-led during the Iraq War. We brought community groups from Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria together, managing to bring a group from and to Baghdad safely while bombs were falling around them. Well, that's enough about me for the moment. Let me share 2 stories with you. In one of the Boston prison projects, I met a young man. His name was Q. As a Latino immigrant, he had had a childhood of poverty, of being abused sexually, physically, and psychologically, and had spent many years behind bars from the time he was a young man. When Q arrived in the prison classroom, he was shy and withdrawn. I proceeded with a routine circle exercise that involved closing eyes, envisioning, dreaming, imagining, meditating, and holding hands. To be clear, men do not close their eyes in a prison unless, of course, they're in their own cells. What I didn't know then, but knew much later, was that in the same room, Q had a mortal enemy, someone from another gang, someone who wanted to destroy him. The 2 men surrendered their gang-based enmity through the collaborative, artistic, and dialogue process, through sharing stories working towards a friendship that they could never have imagined possible. The second story. Many years ago in Jerusalem, I co-founded the Community Heart Song Project, an initiative that brought young Jewish Israelis and Palestinians together for dialogue and musical sharing. These young people during the workshops repeatedly shared that what they had in common was more than what kept them apart. In a deeply segregated country like Israel, most of the Jewish Israelis had had little, if any, interaction with young Palestinians. From all the signs, this project appeared to be kind of successful, except one evening in Jerusalem, I received a call from one of the young Palestinian participants. She had something urgent to tell me, she said. So she came round and I listened to her, and when she said, "Don't you understand? They all tell you that this is a good project because they like working with you. We have a problem here. These Israelis are going to leave school and go into military service, and their guns are going to be pointed at Palestinians. This project is flawed." I was flabbergasted. I waited in silence. I was completely wordless. I said, then, after a while, "So what should I do? Must I stop this project or what?" And she waited for a long time and then said, "I guess doing nothing is not an option. We all have to be engaged in working this out. It's better for you to continue with this than not." Locating myself in this work requires me to have a very clear lens, political, human, philosophical, and I'd like to lay out what that means. First, I oppose violence in all its forms: physical, structural, symbolic, systemic, epistemological, and cultural. I don't need to enlarge on what I mean by physical violence. By structural, symbolic, systemic, I refer to the systems in place, sometimes almost invisible, that represent the asymmetries of power that have emerged organically and that continue to perpetuate privilege and marginalization on a global scale and in micro spaces. By cultural violence, I refer to beliefs and norms that dehumanize the other, whether Black, Jewish, as with anti-Semitic, refugee, queer, Latinx, Arab, Asian, untouchables, beliefs such as the 19th century manifest destiny, or its more contemporary offshoot, the Great Replacement theory. I'm sure you're familiar with these, but they're up there for those who might not be. Epistemological violence is very well represented in educational institutions, healthcare, legal system, where we privilege certain knowledge, ways of seeing, making, writing, and understanding as superior. In short, subtle forms and not so subtle forms of white supremacy are widespread, perhaps widespread. On violence, one of our distinguished alumni, the great Martin Luther King, said, "Violence is impractical because it is a descending spiral ending in destruction for all. It is immoral because it seeks to humiliate the opponent rather than win his understanding. It seeks to annihilate rather than convert. Violence is immoral because it thrives on hatred rather than love. It destroys community. It leaves society in monologue rather than dialogue. Violence ends up defeating itself." My second personal philosophical stance is in the essential sanctity, indeed holiness, of every life, that all life is equally valuable not only in dying, but in living. In a deeply stratified social system here and abroad, it is clear that we have failed the social contract to value all lives equally. Our society is anything but fair. It is not only unfair, but inequitable and increasingly so. Equal value of human beings is a living concept of justice and fairness that relates to the golden rule. Thirdly, on every issue that I can think of, I take a position, a side, if you like. As one of BU's former professors, Howard Zinn, said, "You can't be neutral on a moving train." And the great Elie Wiesel, for whom our center is named, said, and I quote, "We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere. When human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever men and women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must become the center of the universe. And taking sides allows us to see our relationship with what Elie Wiesel calls the tormentor and the tormented. That includes the essential ingredient of accountability. In transformational justice, accountability enables us to begin a pathway for forgiveness and reconciliation. Finally, the word peace, well, finally only for this part of this presentation, the word peace has different meanings for different people. What does it mean for you? Now take your phone again. Let's go to the screen, see the QR code, and you know how this goes, right? So, and this says peace means, and then you complete the prompt. And we're going to see, because this is a critical part of my presentation, we're going to, has everybody grabbed the QR code there? And apologies for those who didn't bring devices with them. Paper would have been an advantage for those people, but I'm sorry then. Okay, so now Brian's going to take us over to the Mentimeter screen. So even peace means illusion, or working constructively, or being able to be yourself. So peace for me is a process, not an outcome. It is not simply the absence of war. It is an affirmation of a dream and a commitment to walk a long and difficult path. I am with Martin Luther King in recognizing that there is no peace without justice and no justice without peace. And peace is a struggle, an intentional struggle to establish harmonious relationships, whether interpersonal or global. To be engaged in peace seeking can be an act of resistance to power. I found that in speaking about peace, people mean different things, as we've seen. I've heard so often from my Israeli and Palestinian participants that they just want to live in peace. But when we dig deeper, we find that when they say they want to live in peace, they have fundamental disagreements. Let me turn now to dialogue. The crisis of polarization and tribalism makes dialogue skills more urgently needed than ever before. By dialogue, I mean an intentional approach to communication that aims to build relationships and forge new understanding across cultural and social divides. It is a situated, critical practice with liberatory goals, inviting participants to critically examine their social realities. There are three important conceptual building blocks that ground my concept of dialogue: naming the world, divergence, and shared imaginary. These building blocks connect to four resources: storying and restorying, voice, deep listening, and imagining. The first building block is what Paulo Freire calls naming the world. Now, naming the world is a process of identifying inequities and injustice in order to act against them towards their transformation. Reflecting upon and naming systems of oppression and privilege is a process that can transform realities. When we name the world, not only do we critically and dialogically write our past, but we venture into the future, expressing dreams and aspirations. For emphasis, let me say this again. When we name the world, not only do we critically and dialogically write our past, but we venture into the future, expressing dreams and aspirations. This process, when enacted collectively, gives rise to the creation and manifestation of a shared future imaginary, a shared future. This critical practice then enables participants to imagine and practice new possibilities of living, working, relating, and being together, co-creating a shared future imaginary. The second building block, on divergence, peace-building expert John Paul Lederach suggests that building social change must intentionally seek to link people who are not like-minded and not like-situated in context. It is necessary to acknowledge that the intersectionality of like-mindedness and like-situatedness. So let me explain what I mean. The differences are often, we talk about differences very often by talking about lines of identity, such as race, ethnicity, language, Israelis, Palestinians, etc., black, brown, white, queer, so on. Perfectly fine, but not sufficient, as these are significant lines along which inequity is perpetuated. However, the patterns of entrenched polarization are often of perspective and ideology rather than of identity and cosmological worldview. It may be much easier for two people from opposing sides of a conflict to meet and build a constructive relationship if they share the same political orientation. For example, progressives and liberals, even if they are opposing sides and having the same political orientation. Thus, dialogue processes need to embrace the unique constellations of experience that inform each individual's positionality and identity layers. Dialogue may find its expression across any of these constellation points, emphasizing relationality and providing space for both like-mindedness and like-situatedness. The third building block, the shared imaginary. Think about this as a shared dream or shared future. This is underpinned by transforming and imagining as a social practice. Imagining here is not a fantasy. It's not an escape. It's not contemplation. It is more than that. It is a focused practice. It's a key step that from naming the world to enacting change. The envisioning of a shared future is crucial to transformation of the shared and concrete present, and collective artistic creation offers flexible, inclusive, and powerful communicative vehicles for its mobilization. The process of the imaginary is embedded in liberatory ideas such as African American freedom dreaming and other freedom movements such as the Dalit Panthers in India and other liberatory struggles in Latin America and beyond. So how do these building blocks work in practice? I center 4 resources and capabilities common to both artistic co-creation and dialogue. These are storying and restorying, voice, deep listening, and imagining. And the reason I say artistic co-creation is very often people think about music, but music is fundamentally a cultural monologue, at least as well as much as practiced in the Eurocentric frame. Whereas that's why I talk about this idea of co-creation, artistic co-creation. So you see these 4 resources. So let me go through these 4 resources. Storying. Everybody comes in with a story. Everybody has a story. And story in peace building and social justice work is central. Violent conflict disrupts, destroys, distorts, and corrupts collective stories. So restorying is a critical process for integrating past events, lived and historic, into the present to build a vision for the future and to dislodge the assumptions of the dominant story in that context. And you can, as Nancy referred to it, we have dominant stories all the time. We have to restory what we hear or provide alternative stories. Dialogue offers possibilities for conceiving, storying, inviting a reauthoring of community that may not be possible without such engagement. Second resource is voice. Now, voice is understood both literally and metaphorically as an audible communicative tool, as well as a source and index of social power. Words spoken, sung, or written can be a way of speaking back to authority and restoring deficit narratives. Voicing is a form of expression, adaptation, assimilation, as well as aspiration and agency. In contrast, voicelessness as a metaphor may indicate a sense of not being heard, of being silenced through repressive forces, or through the unspeakable nature of one's experiences, as I've seen with people who experience torture. Or as we experience in today's climate, a self-suppression of perspective where people can't speak about the things they can't speak about. I work to strengthen participants' voices to ensure that dialogue proceeds on the basis of relatively balanced power, considering the diverse modes of voicing that arts making can nurture. Deep listening. This is an important one because in a moment you see the word listening, but you have to see the adjective before that. Deep listening is a discipline, an art form, a healing practice, and a form of activism. Deep listening, once again, is an art form, a healing practice, and a form of activism. It is a capacity captured, for example, in the Australian indigenous concept Dadiri, where one attends to another person's story within the complexity of history and the non-linear ways that humans make meaning through words, images, and gestures. I think I talk about listening with the heart, listening with the eyes, listening with the body, listening with the whole being, listening without judgment. All of those. It's a spiritual act. It requires humility, moving away from consumption of another's ideas towards building new relationships and shared purpose. Dialogue is impossible without a commitment to listening, to deep listening, and arts in and arts as dialogue. So arts in dialogue and arts as dialogue are ways in which we can build listening and participant capacity in multimodal ways. And the last of those four resources is imagining. Imagining is a resource that underscores the common ground and purpose of arts creation and dialogue. Both arts creation and dialogue engage in processes of discovery that bring into existence something new. The imagining required in a social context marked by difference and mistrust can be understood as moral imagination, defined by Lederach as, I quote, the capacity to imagine something rooted in the challenges of the real world, yet capable of giving birth to that which does not exist. This idea, the world that does not exist. The world we want is not the world we have. We want a different world, not the world we have now. And the idea of to imagine, this idea of the moral imagination. So in fostering my participants' creative capacities, their capacity to bring into existence new relationships, stories, and shared imaginary will be similarly enhanced. So how does this framework apply to my practice? Our pedagogy in schools and colleges are built on the edifice of monologue, as I've said, and expertise. We have classrooms, we have lecture halls, we have experts, and we have students who are non-expert, who are waiting to be suitably transformed and taught. My pedagogy, that was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but my pedagogy is empowering song, a pedagogy that is subversive, disobedient, and transgressive. So the pedagogy I use is a way of knowing and creating that emphasizes personal expression, community mobilization, and dialogue. I displace the Eurocentric disciplinary boundaries between the genres of visual arts, theater, music, and other artistic practice. Empowering song is epistemically democratic and abolitionist, a trans-pedagogical practice, transdisciplinary, transgenerational, transgressive, transcendent, and transborder. So I've already told you a little bit about Community Heart Song Project with those young Israeli-Palestinian projects. So well, about almost 10 years ago, my local partners and I co-founded Common Ground Voices as a collaborative, dialogue-based Israeli-Palestinian arts making group. We met for the first time in Sweden, actually, and the reason because of the Wallenberg support. We met in Sweden because also at that time it was hazardous to meet in Jerusalem. Since then, we have met regularly. The makeup of the group varies, but we have Israelis and Palestinians with divergent views and dispositions. They come they're both unlike-minded and unlike-situated very often, and that's something we welcome. They come with stories of harm, stories of violence, and broken dreams. They come to us and to expect to be nourished by these practices. We know how to discuss, to argue, to contest, to interrogate, but what we're all doing is to learn how to engage in dialogue as a distinct practice. For those of you who have not had the privilege of working or being with Israelis or Palestinians, you may not be aware of the kaleidoscope of political positions. I reject any attempt to cast either Israelis or Palestinians into homogeneous groups or singular political positions, as the media might have us believe. They come from richly diverse constellations of perspective. That includes those who support the current Israeli Prime Minister and those who wish to dismantle the state, those who are ultra-Orthodox religious Jews who are firmly anti-Zionist, and others who believe that the Holy Land was given to the Jewish people to occupy and settle. In my limited anecdotal experience, the fractures of political perspectives amongst Jewish Israelis are enormous. Palestinians are also richly diverse in many other ways, and I could make that a whole subject of a talk, but let me move on. Common Ground Voices welcomes not only Israelis and Palestinians who are like-minded, unlike-minded, like-situated, unlike-situated, but also non-Israelis, non-Palestinians. After all, I'm neither Israeli nor Palestinian. And in our most recent residency in August of this year, one of our participants was an Iranian refugee who had never been in the same space as an Israeli. He had never heard Hebrew spoken live, and he was terrified of what that might mean to be in the presence of an Israeli. He also had he was also worried about being able to speak, being able to speak Hebrew poetry or to be able to sing a Hebrew song and so forth. And for him it was an act of courage because he can't ever, after having collaborated with Israelis, he can't go back to Iran. And I warned him about that. I said, if you go back to Iran, you place yourself at risk. He said, yes, if I go back to Iran, I'll be put to death. So he made a conscious, intentional decision to engage in this project, knowing that there was no going back to Iran after that. Typically, so what do these residencies look like? Typically, we come together for about 5 days, being together from morn till night, making, listening, creating, grieving, consoling. I can't claim that tensions get resolved. We have countless moments of tension. These tensions never resolve completely. After all, participants bring a long history of harm, of despair, and very often fixed positions and closed minds. Let me give you one example. One of our Israeli participants lost a family member at the Nova Festival on October the 7th. And if you don't know, that was the festival that was on the border of Gaza that was attacked, and she lost a family member who was murdered at that festival. She was understandably focused on her loss, her grief, and outrage in describing what took place. One of our other participants objected to her characterizing of the people who perpetrated that as terrorists. He objected to that. This is a moment of heightened tension that stayed with us through the project and appeared in our final public presentation, because in our final public presentation, she spoke about that one loss, that one tragedy. And the Palestinian participants felt that that was a disproportionate representation of harm. More about that later if we have questions. What I observed was not the resolution of the difference, but the open dialogue that ensued, grounded in listening, in deep listening, rather than in adversarial discussion. We usually bring outside perspectives to bear. Most recently, we engaged with Breaking the Silence, an organization of veteran Israeli soldiers who worked towards ending the Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. He spoke candidly about the brutality, the unspeakable brutality that soldiers are required to commit. Last year, we engaged, as a contrast, with an Israeli settler who was, in his own way, trying to find a collaborative path with West Bank Palestinians. Each of these perspectives aroused deep feelings. Where we engage in deep listening, the restoring can take place. The arts work is co-creative, always collaborative. One example, we had 2 songs about Jerusalem, one in Arabic and one in Hebrew. Rather than leaving them as separate and distinct, we fused them together substituting text, so that in the end it was not their song or their song, it was our song. It was a new song. This idea of a new song, a new dream. The same with poetry and visual narratives, where we write and create collaboratively. We engage in numerous collaborative exercises, too many to describe individually. Exercises that are designed not to hide divergence, but to amplify it. For reasons of confidentiality, I have no recordings to share of our most profound and heartbreaking dialogue moments. But these photographs show engagement. And there are just 4 photographs I have to share with you that give you a little bit of a picture of at least, you see their faces. And there have been no happy endings in this project. Rather, there are moments of resolution, unanswered questions, and self-questioning. I ask myself, and I ask you today, where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And again, it is when history seems at its most bleak that the determination to think like a human being, creatively, courageously, and complicatedly matters the most. This question is urgently relevant for all of us. I would suggest that creative dialogue, story, voice, deep listening, imagining can be where we find creativity and courage. We are also presented today, all of us here today, with a tough fork in the road. A fork in the road, revenge on one side or forgiveness. They don't sit easily together. I've seen remarkable acts of forgiveness in the midst of horrific violence. And I wonder how people find the courage to embark on this journey of forgiveness. It is a huge challenge to forgive when all our national rhetoric seems to be vindictive, indeed almost glorifying revenge. This country seems to be hell-bent on revenge. We glorify it. Our political parties manifest it every single day. But I hold that forgiveness belongs within the process of dialogue. My work raises more questions than answers, and I continue to be troubled by it. Am I being simplistic? Am I making a difference to public policy, even to the people who participate? What are the implications for free speech? To what extent do microspatial grassroots initiatives change the impacts further downstream? Will this work make any difference to those most deeply affected? Will it make any difference to those who hold the power to interrupt cycles of violence, ecological extraction, and endless war, and to our government and governments all over the world that continue to violate international law and the laws of common decency, and to the merchants of war and state agents who design and profit from slow death? Will it change the hearts of the apathetic bystanders who passively benefit from the maintenance of borders and the regimes of war? As an activist, I hope that my work makes a difference, but I am uncertain, even as I am overwhelmed with grief and outrage about the appalling misery and brutality that continue to devastate people here and around the world. I remember, I don't know if some of you do, but I remember the excruciatingly horrific image of Kevin Carter's 1993 Pulitzer Prize-winning photo of the collapsed, starving child near Vulture. I'm not showing the image today. Has anything changed since Carter's photo was published? By the way, Kevin Carter committed suicide after he won the Pulitzer Prize. 2 decades ago, Susan Sontag reminded us of our collective shame and shock, and yet there are no words for the horrors of war that we have witnessed in the last year. No amount of shame or shock seems to shake us out of this endless loop of violence, and yet I feel called to the shatter zones to bear witness, nevertheless. Showing up in these zones may not change anything for my participants, but it has irrevocably changed me. I cannot look away. Because I now realize that we are all part of this story. We are all accountable. We are all complicit. In not looking away, in joining together in compassion, grief, rage, and joy, perhaps we can walk on the path towards collective liberation. As someone who is deeply committed to collective forgiveness and reconciliation based on truth-telling, accountability, and justice, I would like to finish with a piece of poetry. A poem called Ceasefire, written by the celebrated Irish poet Michael Longley. Now, Michael Longley wrote this poem in 1994. It was published in 1998. And as Michael Longley said, more important than the critics' affirmation of this poem was the fact that he received a message from the father, the man who was blown up, a father of the boy who was blown up in the boat with Lord Mountbatten. The background of the poem is that Hector, the son of King Priam of Troy, is killed by Achilles, the strongest Greek warrior. In the Greek epic Homer's Iliad, King Priam kisses the hands of his son's killer. Longley wrote the poem during a terrible time of violence and peace-seeking in Ireland. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes, and I'm going to read the poem to you twice. I'll read it twice, and after that will be the end of my presentation. Ceasefire. Put in mind of his own father and moved to tears, Achilles took him by the hand, pushed the old king gently away, but Priam curled up at his feet and wept with him until their sadness filled the building. Taking Hector's corpse into his own hands, Achilles made sure it was washed, and for the old king's sake, laid out in uniform, ready for Priam to carry, wrapped like a present, home to Troy at daybreak. When they had eaten together, it pleased them both to stare at each other's beauty as lovers might. Achilles built like a god, Priam good-looking still, and full of conversation, who earlier had sighed, I get down on my knees and do what must be done, and kiss Achilles' hand, the killer of my son. Ceasefire. Put in mind of his own father and moved to tears, Achilles took him by the hand and pushed the old king gently away. But Priam curled up at his feet and wept with him until their sadness filled the building. Taking Hector's corpse into his own hands, Achilles made sure it was washed, and for the old king's sake, laid out in uniform, ready for Priam to carry, wrapped like a present home to Troy at daybreak. When they had eaten together, it pleased them both to stare at each other's beauty as lovers might. Achilles built like a god, Priam good-looking still, and full of conversation, who earlier had sighed, I get down on my knees and do what must be done and kiss Achilles' hand, the killer of my son.
André told us that he had been changed by this work. I am so grateful for the opportunity to be touched by that change as well in this room today. He also said that he didn't know if any of those who had engaged in the work with him had been changed. And I've been reading this recently published book, One Sky, Many Destinies, that André edited. The writers are from nearby prisons where they are incarcerated, responding to his work. And I think this will, I hope, give us some answer to that question of whether they have been changed. This is about the empowering song. The empowering song approach did such a remarkable job of rehumanizing incarcerated persons that the course became a threat to the traditional culture of institutionalized oppression and dehumanization. This is written by an incarcerated man named Thomas Jeffries. Jeffries continues, this course began to be scrutinized by the prison administration and staff more aggressively than any other course offered. The prison began to interfere with the course by limiting what the professors could bring in, what they can accept from us as homework, and what they could return to us as graded material. Now, this example gives us the understanding of why this program gets frowned upon the most, and why the system wants control over anything that could cause us to understand our human value. The empowering song approach was pulling emotions and substance out of us that held the potential to create an awareness of our depth of isolation and oppression, and that carried with it a potential spark that could ignite activism. This voice from a prison cell that André brought to us. I'm so grateful that André put up this quote from Elie Wiesel. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. There is a reason that fascists burn the books before the bodies. They know that art and ideas, dialogue are powerful. This is also one of the reasons why some groups have attempted to shut down events like this one. With an incredible and intrepid team of colleagues at the Center on Forced Displacement and Cura and WGS and many others, and those folks are here, they've worked to organize events and conversations like this one about the war in Israel, Gaza, and the region this fall. So grateful to you all. But groups within BU and outside have tried to cancel every single one of those events, whether they have been perceived as pro or anti-Israel, pro or anti-Palestinians, and we never conceive of the events in those tired binaries. Often it's because people in those groups were misinformed about what those events were doing. But I also think we know that ideas are powerful. We can't allow them to cancel art, ideas, and dialogue. Even if, like this one, the events are not always comfortable. We need the dialogue that André sponsors, especially in a university, especially now. We can't be the ones trying to burn the books. Because of the power of art and ideas, a power André shows us so well and adapts for his consistent social justice mission, I think it's also really important to acknowledge what art and dialogue cannot do or cannot do alone. And I humbly acknowledge art's limitations as a poet and a performer, a person with an artistic practice, as well as the critical theoretical practice of a researcher. And increasingly, I don't see a distinction between those two. Like Professor de Quadros, I believe that art is essential to everyone, not just the elite and privileged. Art is particularly essential to those who need art to imagine a world in which they can survive. But I have to offer a list of what art and dialogue cannot do. This is partially because I'm always really frustrated when the technophilic researcher promises us that technology will solve all the problems, or the medical researcher presents medicine as the panacea. So what art cannot do, and what art can. Art can change lives, but it cannot save them from machine guns. We say books, not bombs, but the book will not turn the bomb away from the city. The book will burn, not put out the fire engulfing the house or the hospital. One of my favorite poets, Emily Dickinson, wrote, "She knows poetry if she feels physically as if the top of my head were taken off. But poetry cannot repair the head penetrated by shrapnel." Art is a part of every protest movement. There is an aesthetic dimension. It can change how we see the world and help us think of an entirely new way of being in the world. It's essential. But art alone will not bring that world into existence. My main point is that art can change lives, as we've seen today. But art, music, dialogue will not bring about a peace that requires political solutions to deadly structural injustices. Art is powerful, but it does not have that power. This is partially because art is so unpredictable. André tells us he's discovered this delightful and infuriating unpredictability. We often don't know in advance how or when it will reach its audience and have impact. There are no easy metrics of success here. There are no learning outcomes to be achieved. It's one of the reasons that I feel the need to resist that language of metrics of impact. The impact might crash into a student long after our time on this planet is over. Art can help us understand the meanings of our lives arcing to death, and especially what aspects of that journey we will never understand. André de Quadros knows all of this and uses the power and unpredictability of art for the work he calls empowering song, drawing from music, poetry, movement, the essays in this book, the art and drawings. He's brought empowering song to people incarcerated in prisons near us, detention centers at the border with Mexico, spaces of violence and trauma. He's worked with survivors of war and torture, and he's working with Israelis and Palestinians caught in nearly 80 years of displacement, violence, racism, and war. I hope I can open up the discussion today and invite you all to join by asking a little bit about what is different in these spaces for him and the work he's doing in the prisons and borders in Palestine, in Israel. How do you navigate those differences as an artist teacher in the complex structures of power, race, and religion?